to give the context, we're interested in whether Chinese popular attitudes about the current patterns of inequality and the chances of ordinary people to get ahead and how they get ahead in China have changed in recent years. And the context is that I started working on the general question of inequality and popular perceptions of inequality more than 2 decades ago. And at the time I started interested in this topic, it was commonly said that although China was growing fast and becoming more prosperous, but there was one very serious negative trend, which was China was becoming much more unequal. According to the Gini coefficient, a standard sort of national summary index, China started out with a relatively moderate level of around 0.3, because basically everybody was pretty much dirt poor. But by recent times, China is around 0.50, or according to some estimates, even higher. Some indicators indicate China is a more unequal society today in terms of income distribution than the United States, which is the most unequal advanced capitalist country. And China has more dollar billionaires than the US does, and so forth. And at the time that I first started studying this more than 20 years ago, there were constantly, it was said in China that this was a dangerous trend. It was common to see the claim that whenever the Gini goes above 0.4, China enters a danger zone for political protests and instability and possible challenges to party rule. So I started out by trying to conduct survey research in China to see whether this was an accurate summary of people's attitudes toward inequality. And the first national survey I directed was in 2004. And lo and behold, I discovered that this what I call a social volcano scenario was not true at all. And here's the 2010 book, which I published, Myth of the Social Volcano, which essentially said the respondents in the 2004 survey were not that upset about inequality. They thought in general that people could get ahead and were very optimistic about getting ahead, and they could get ahead by individual merit, by working hard, by having talent, by having more education and so forth, and that the rising pattern of inequality didn't really block them. And starting with this first survey, I was also able to do comparisons with other countries because we used survey questions that have been used in advanced capitalist countries and other post-socialist countries in Eastern Europe and in Japan and so forth. And it turns out that Chinese in 2004 were more likely to say that the reason somebody is rich or poor is due to differences in talent or differences in how hard they worked or education and so forth. They weren't due to unfairness of society, discrimination, dishonesty, and so forth. And they were also much more optimistic about people being able to get ahead in the future than these other countries. So, but nonetheless, people after I did that survey and published this book said, well, wait a minute, maybe this is just a good time and things are going to get worse. So in 2009, I did a second national survey, and this was after the 2008 global financial crisis, which had at least some effect on China with hurting export manufacturing and so forth. And then a third survey in 2014, which again, by then China was already slowing down its economic growth rate. It was no longer growing at over 10% a year. And basically in those two surveys, I found much the same pattern. There was still no social volcano. I was looking for the social volcano, but it didn't. And in fact, in some ways, even though growth was slower, people in the 2014 survey were even more optimistic about their ability to get ahead than they were in the 2000. So to give one example that's maybe in Scott Rozell's slides in the second half of this presentation, one of the questions we asked was, 5 years from now, do you think you'll be doing much better, about the same, worse, or much worse? And summarizing the better and much better, in 2004, 58% of our respondents said they thought they would be doing better or much better, which is a huge amount. I haven't done this in the US, but I very much doubt that 58% of Americans would say that 5 years from now, they'll be doing better and much better. In 2014, 73% said that in 5 years they would be doing better or much better. So the question is, what's going on here? Why were Chinese so accepting of the fact that their society was becoming so much more unequal? And the basic framework we use in the paper is one Liz Perry will be familiar with. It starts out with resilient authoritarianism. How does the Chinese Communist Party, has it retained its hold on power while other communist parties have fallen apart? And basically the argument is there are a lot of different factors one could cite, but the main one is just this extraordinary growth and improvement in the standard of living and every, food, housing, educational access and so forth. China has had a dramatic improvement in the standard of living of its entire population, pretty much. The rising tide of growth has lifted virtually all boats. It hasn't lifted them equally. So the rich have gotten even richer. But nonetheless, most people feel that they have been felt in these 3 earlier surveys that they were benefiting. Okay. So this has contributed to a performance legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. In other words, the fact that the party has presided over a world historical improvement in living standards and so forth. By the way, let me give a plug for another book, not by me, by Wang Feng, China's Age of Abundance. This has incredibly rich statistical evidence about all the different aspects of people's lives that have improved so dramatically during the reform period, okay? However, the problem is the last survey I directed was in 2014. Well, that's 10 years ago. And after all, a lot of things have changed since then, and particularly since 2020 with COVID and the further slowing of the economy and the perils in the collapse of the housing market and rising youth unemployment and so forth. And a little over a year ago at the AAS meetings in Boston, I think Qin Gao was also involved in the inequality panel at the AAS. But Scott and I were talking afterwards and saying, "Oh, it's too bad. We can't do a new survey to find out how people feel today. Maybe they finally now are getting more angry or more discontented." But then Scott remembered he had ongoing survey collaborations, particularly with Gan Li and his colleagues at the Southwestern University of Finance and Economics in Chengdu. And he knew that they were about to start a new survey, an online survey, to be sure, at the end of 2023. And maybe they would consent to include some of the same questions that we had used in these 3 national surveys, many of them also used in these earlier surveys in advanced capitalist countries and other post-socialist countries and so forth. So, and in fact, that is what happened. They included, crucially, 2 different kinds of items in the questionnaire for the 2023 surveys. First, a set of questions about why do you think some people are rich, and why do you think some people are poor? And you give a number of possible reasons, and they have to say how important one or another is. And those include individual merit and human capital explanations like hard work and talent and education, but they also include societal unfairness and discrimination and different family backgrounds and so forth. And then the second set of questions had to do with optimism. And as you can already tell from the title of the paper, From Optimism to Pessimism, the subtitle, what we found was very different than in the 2004 to 2014 earlier surveys. So this paper that we're discussing today is summarizing how dramatically things have changed and what that means. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague Scott Rosell to present the summary of what the actual findings were when you compare the 2023 survey with the 3 earlier surveys.
Thank you, Marty. And it was actually, sorry, go back up to the top. It was actually, yeah, at the Asia Studies meetings that Marty and I got together. And we had just been doing a phone survey. I hadn't been back to China in 3.5 years. We were doing a phone survey of a sample we'd had for COVID. I mean, we were so we didn't want to talk about COVID anymore, but we were talking about who got back to work, and there were so many rural people that hadn't gone back to work yet. This is March of 2023, and the news was talking about 10 million urban youth between 16 and 24 without a job. Well, we were finding 200 million rural people without a job. By the summer, most of them had gone back to work, though at much, much lower rates than they'd been. But that's when I came to Marty and said, there's a lot of pessimism out there, and we decided to do this. The first few slides I'm going to go through really quick because Marty basically has covered them. And, because, the motivation is exactly what Marty said, is when the genie was going up, were people going to be unhappy? And, was there going to be an explosion of the social volcano, which was a myth through 2014. But in the meantime, just like Marty said, there's rising global tensions. There's COVID-19. There's youth unemployment, right? There's the rise of social media, and we're digging deeper into these numbers now, and we're finding that 10 years after Marty did a survey, as people got social media, they said that they're doing really well in life, and then they start seeing all these people that have so much more money than them. That may be one of the reasons too. Is we wanted to fill this gap. Had things changed, right? What's the current pattern of inequality in people's view, and how optimistic or pessimistic towards the future was going to be. So our data, exactly what Marty said, 2004, 2009, 2014, it was in-person national representative with Peking University's Research Center, Contemporary China. It was a fantastic organization that was right next to our Stanford Center there, and so I'd always go and see the people back there. And then in 2023, it was online. The sample was much bigger, but it was online. And as Marty told you, we took all of this. I should say we took all of this data then, and we made it national representative by gender, by province, by age, and by education. So even though we didn't get the perfect national representative sample as you do an online survey, is we corrected the data in the same way from 2004, 2009, 2014, 2023 with the most recent, most closest national censuses. So these are as close as we can get to national representative data. And so face-to-face interviews are Martyr, and online interviews, for us. And what you can see, the little boxes there are the different ages. Look at the orange and the grays for the age distribution, the gender distribution, and the education distribution. And you can see that once we adjusted it, it looks very much like what the world looks like in China today. So, and that's what we're trying to get at. So here's where we go. So this is what we ask. So I always tell the story. Marty's old one-on-one question, and I actually I ask a lot of these myself. Is do you know that there's high inequality in China? And the guy is wiping the window of a BMW, and he says, "That ain't my BMW." Everybody knows there's high inequality in China. And then we'd find out if they were rich or poor. And then if they were poor, this bottom medium, we'd say, "Why are you poor?" And this is the survey that they got: lack of ability, bad luck, poor character, unequal opportunity, unfair economic system. So there's basically two main sets of it. So there's human capital characteristics of yourself. Why are you poor? And then there's characteristics of the economy out there. Okay. And then you'd say not at all, very good, a small amount. Okay, and here's the main sort of results of our study here, right? And it's there you go. In 2004, 09, 014, you say, why are you poor? And it says, because I don't have a good ability. I'm just not capable, right? And look at how that thing changes in 2023. It drops to number 6. Okay. Lack of effort. I just don't work hard enough. Right. And that went from number 2 to number 5. Education. You can see education is still in the equation in 2023. What you're going to see, though, is the percentage went down. Okay. So even though it's still, very, it's high in the ranking. And then, oops, there we go. The other thing we said was the exact opposite. Is look at here, and this is 04 to 14 here. Unequal opportunity was number 5. Unfair economic system was number 9. Nobody chose it. Okay, look at this in 2023. It's number 1. I'm poor because there's unequal opportunities. I'm poor because the economic system is unfair. Just this quick reversal, and you can see by the percentages of people that said a sum of large and very large influence. So this was large, went down. So why are you poor? People said I'm poor because lack of ability went from 61 to 31%. See the percentages go down, and for the economic system it went up. Okay. Then we ask the opposite. We ask for the rest of it. Why are you rich? Okay. And you can see the same type of questions. And in 2014, I'm rich because I'm talented, also human capital. I'm rich because I work hard. And I'm rich because I have high education. Look at by 2023. This is for the rich people. The rich people said, even if I'm highly educated, it doesn't mean I'm going to be rich anymore. Okay. And ability and talent, hard work fell dramatically, while guanxi, connections, went from number 3 to number 1. Unfair economic system went from 9 to 6, and better opportunities went from 5 to 3. So you can see the same thing is that human capital has fallen, and the problems with the economic system have risen, right? That's what we're seeing. And then Marty had these really interesting sets of questions that he's already talked about, which I think captures everything, right? It's, why is there high inequality and you don't care about it? It's because compared to 5 years ago, how do you feel about your current economic? 70%, that's exactly what Marty said, I'm doing better than 5 years ago. It's only 38% today. Okay. 8.4% of the people said I'm doing worse. I think I'm doing worse. Now it's 27%. This is where we go back and forth. We say the volcano's not going to erupt here because 74% of people don't think they're going to get worse off than before, but it's going up, right? And thinking that they're going to be better off is going down. And this is about in the future. So here's the future. 66% of the people said, I'm going to be better off in the future. And 47% only think of that today. It's still half of the people think they're going to be better off, in the future. And only 16% think they're going to be worse off. Okay. So, I think that we see this real change of the way people are looking at the economy. I've been in China 3 months now, and I've been to the rural areas many times. I've talked to many, and it's that pessimism. Scott, is it going to get better, right? Professor Law, right? Exactly. And that I think that if the economy boosted up, a lot of the optimism would even come back. And as you see, it's sort of right there. Okay, so comparisons with past and future expectations compared to 5 years ago, big fall. This is for the poor people. Okay, so these are the poor people. It went from 78% thinking they're going to get better to 28%. So this is where sort of Marty and I would think that maybe is one of the most important, sets of numbers. And this is about 5 years from now. It's from 85 down to 35. Okay, and so for the poor people in China, the numbers above were for everyone. This is for the poor. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to talk about in our country, effort's always rewarded. look at the fall from 61% to 28%. Whether a person becomes rich or remains poor is his own responsibility. That fell, right? Nowadays, opportunity for people to succeed is the same for everyone, down to less than 20%. And given the domestic situation, there's still opportunity like you to improve. That's fallen from 60 to, less than 30%. So, I think that, our implications and conclusions, are basically that selected inequality, we replicated these, tried to do it as much as we can. But let me tell you what it is, I told Marty, we're going to do this in July and we're going to get this done. And I want to see this. And the results came back so different, like you see, as Marty said, no one will believe us. So then we redid it in October, we redid it in December, and you saw the results here. So ordinary citizens of China aren't feeling as strongly that this current pattern of inequality are merit-based, as well as being optimistic about getting the future, okay? You can see it's down, it's not out. And, that's, what we're trying to say, is the volcano starting to simmer, right? Is the ground starting to tremble? It's certainly not ready to explode, okay? And so that's what we say here. And the results do suggest, however, that performance legitimacy accumulated by the leadership through decades of growth, that's what kept people into this system. Now that that's hurting, it's beginning to be undermined, this legitimacy. So I have basically got to there. I wanted to thank Marty for coming back and forth on us, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from the panelists and from Scott Kay, the other part of Big Data China. And thank you, Ilaria, for organizing all this.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Scott and Marty, for your fantastic research and for presenting the core findings today. As this is a Big Data China collaboration where we do try and feature path-breaking work and introduce it to the policy community and folks beyond academia. And Ilaria and I have written a feature about this research, which we'll be publishing on the CSIS website, the Big Data China microsite, later today. And everyone who's watching can dig into that data themselves. We circulated their draft academic paper and our draft feature to several people who I consider my scholar heroes, people who do amazing work on Chinese politics and society, who, when I'm trying to figure out what's going on, I go read their work and I try to listen to what they say. And we're lucky to have them today at this event, which we titled, "Is It Me or the Economic System?" because we tried to find a way to sum up the core question about what are the explainers and drivers of inequality, and whether or not people feel that inequality is just or unjust. What is their views about inequity? But we're thrilled today to have just three fantastic scholars help us analyze the research and the implications for China and the rest of the world. Let me introduce these three stars, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to them. Liz Perry is the Henry Rosowski Professor of Government at Harvard University. She recently stepped down after 16 years as the director of the Harvard Yanjing Institute, and she's also former president of the Association for Asian Studies. That's the folks that held the meeting where Marty and Scott discussed whether or not they should go ahead with this survey. Her research focuses on the history of the Chinese Revolution and its implications for contemporary Chinese politics. Jessica Tietz is a professor at Middlebury College, the Templeton Fellow for Asia Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and China Program Fellow at the Wilson Center. And her research focuses on governance in authoritarian regimes, especially the role of civic participation. She has authored and edited several fantastic books, including most recently with Max Gromping, a book everyone should go get, Lobbying the Autocrat, The Dynamics of Policy Advocacy in Non-Democracies. And lastly, but not least, Qin Gao, who is a leading authority on China's social welfare system and the founding director of Columbia University's China Center for Social Policy. She's a faculty affiliate of Columbia's Population Research Center and of the Weatherhead East Asia Institute. And her research examines the changing nature of the Chinese welfare system and its impact on poverty and inequality. She looks at the effectiveness of the DBAO system, which is China's primary social assistance program, social protections for rural to urban migrants in China and Asian American immigrants, and cross-national comparative social policies and programs. Thank you all for taking your time this summer and today to join us to delve into this really important topic about inequality and equity and what it means for China. I want to start with Liz, because as mentioned at the just a second ago, you have looked at the history and evolution of Chinese politics over a long time, where questions of inequality and equity, unfairness have played a large role in explaining the rise and fall and challenges of different political eras in China. We've shared the research with you and would love your first take on what you think the findings that Scott and Marty and their colleagues have found mean for Chinese politics and society. Over to you.
All right. Thank you so much for including me in this fascinating discussion. The results of the survey that Marty and Scott shared with us are entirely consistent with my own personal observations, including 2 trips to China earlier this year. Unlike a decade ago, there is profound pessimism about the economy and about prospects for the future. My own sense is that this may actually indicate something even more serious than a decline in so-called performance legitimacy. After all, Chinese communist rule has already survived remarkably for 75 years now, despite sometimes some quite abysmal performance. We can think back to the horrors of the Great Leap Forward, or more recently to the Tiananmen massacre. And the fact that communist rule has survived for so long in China suggests to me deeper sources of legitimacy than simply economic performance, important as it obviously has been in recent decades. But dating back to the revolution, the party and its leaders have benefited from a widespread belief that the party and its leaders were genuinely committed to putting the people's welfare above their own. Serve the people, 为人民服务. But the pessimism, the malaise that we find so evident across China today reflects, it would seem, a feeling of betrayal of this fundamental social contract, a belief that today's party leaders are much more concerned about their political survival than the well-being of the public. For some, that suspicion predated the COVID pandemic with the abolition of presidential term limits back in 2018. But COVID, I think, confirmed this disillusionment with the party and its leadership for many more, both inside and outside the party itself. At the beginning of the pandemic, it was widely assumed that the draconian lockdown in Wuhan, the intrusive surveillance measures, the health codes in every single individual's cell phone were all being done for the public good. But by the time of the Shanghai lockdown, many had come to see zero COVID as a policy that was designed to strengthen the power of the party leadership more than to benefit ordinary people. And so when people finally protested in massive numbers, restrictions, of course, were summarily lifted, further questioning the zero COVID rationale. They were lifted with no preparation. They were lifted with no explanation, resulting in horrific loss of life. I know almost no one in China who didn't lose an elderly relative in that period. Although the top leader himself remained silent, the ubiquitous references to Xi Jinping thought for a new era that we hear all over China, required curriculum teaching at every level from kindergarten through university these days, suggests that every policy decision is directly attributable to the top leadership. A colleague in China recently told me about another public opinion survey that was conducted there that asked not exactly about inequality per se, but about a range of concerns that ordinary people in China face: unemployment, real estate market collapse, competition for educational opportunities, pollution, and so on. And in the survey, respondents were asked who they blamed for these various problems. Did they blame themselves? Did they blame the wealthy? Did they blame poor migrants? Did they blame local government authorities? Did they blame enterprises? And then there was an other category, Qita, where there was a blank that you could fill in. And apparently an extraordinary number of people chose to write in the blanks for each of these things. And of those who chose to fill in the blank, the vast majority of them filled it in with just a single character, ta, him. So in conclusion, I wonder whether we shouldn't revise the title of today's event. Instead of calling it, "Is it me or the economic system?" Maybe we should be asking, is it me or is it him? But of course, as we know all too well, here in the US, in this moment of an election cycle, the Chinese people are hardly alone in becoming utterly disillusioned with their political leadership, past and present, increasingly suspicious of the motives of their political leaders in trying to prolong their own political longevity. It may well be that China is less of a social volcano than the United States these days. That's utterly possible, I think. I fear we do face an imminent threat to political stability here in our own country because of loss of faith in the political leadership. And I actually wouldn't rule out that this is a very serious concern in China as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Liz. That's extremely helpful. Let me turn to Jessica, who spends a lot of time doing field work in China. She looks at civic engagement, local government, central local relations, how policies issued at the national level are implemented at the local level, local policy innovation. What's your take on the findings from the work that Marty and Scott have unveiled today?
Thank you for inviting me. And it was, I wouldn't say a pleasure to read the article because the findings were definitely not super positive, but they're really important findings. I think seeing that shift from the idea that inequality comes from individual attributes to structural attributes, not only does that redefine the problem of income inequality, but it also suggests different types of solutions. So I think it's really, really important research, and I'm glad that you've done it. And the things that I wanted to talk about, I had just two quick comments for things for you to add into your analysis, and then a more substantive or overarching concern that I wanted to share. So the two easy ones, one is just about the visibility. I found it really interesting in the report that you're talking about the rise of social media making income inequality more visible. So it's not just that inequality has increased, but it's just become more visible so that people before might not have realized the extent of the problem. So if you're in a village and you're looking around at everybody in your street, you assume that that's how everyone's living. And with social media, you can see, no, people are buying sports cars, right? And I wondered if you thought, or if you had any evidence to support the idea that the anti-corruption campaign was also making this visible in a structural way. So just because social media shows you that some people have Ferraris and you're washing the windows of these cars, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's structural, right? But what I'm wondering is, with the anti-corruption campaign, this has gone on for so long, and it's been in every part of the system, state-owned enterprises, the military, local officials. And I wonder if people are seeing that this is structural and more visible through the anti-corruption campaign. So that's one thing that I wondered about. The other was just about the nature of these changing beliefs. A lot of your results you just showed sort of as number of respondents, which is fine, right? That sort of shows us these overall shifts. But I was also wondering if it's concentrated in any way. In my research, I'm seeing bigger shifts among the Gen Z population, sort of 27 years old and younger, and much slower shifts, if any shifts at all, among an older population. And so it'd be interesting to break down your results by age, by income, by party membership, these different sociodemographic variables that we have, to say, is this a linear trend across the board, or do we see some patterns here with some people changing their attribution of why we see inequality to structural concerns, and some people still holding on to these individual attributes? So those are just two small things that would be really interesting to see what you find. The bigger concern that I had, or not concern exactly, but I think what you're finding, that this sort of performance legitimacy of this constant, 10% economic growth that the party relied on throughout the reform era, what your research is showing is that it's no longer effective. But your conclusions are really focused on this idea that the party has to expand economic growth and opportunities in the form of jobs. But I think instead that what Xi Jinping is talking about with his discourse on common prosperity is that old model is broken, that it results in this inequality. And so we can't go back to it. Instead, we have to go in a completely different direction. And so with his discourse on common prosperity and his unwillingness to stimulate the economy in ways that we've seen in the past, he seems to be suggesting, at least to me, a new social contract with the Chinese people. And this one seems to focus a lot more on procedural legitimacy, this conversation about rule by law. And it also seems to change the way that performance legitimacy is measured, away from just economic growth to one of good governance, or what he talks about as responsive government, right? Where the good government is the one that listens and tries to fix problems. And so I think that this is really important for your research. The reason I bring this up is that if this is in fact the new social contract, it makes your findings even more significant, in that we're seeing that your survey results showcase these important points of failure for the government's past policies, but they also point to a different set of solutions that might be in line with common prosperity. So instead of creating more economic opportunities, with some getting rich first, the party instead should focus on voluntarily redistributing wealth from private companies and individuals, what they talk about in common prosperity as tertiary distribution, and moving the entire system to one that's more focused on slow, steady, and sustainable growth. And so, as you started out by talking about, the vision attributed to Mao of equality, except everyone was equally poor, she would like everyone to be equally prosperous, but no one should be rich, right? And so that's a different type of social contract. And the question then, for me at least, comes down to, can he pull this off? So if this is in fact the new social contract, a social contract can't simply be imposed from the top down. It has to resonate with citizens. They have to accept it also. And this depends on two equally unclear things from my perspective. First of all, who do people blame for this inequity? So if they blame Xi Jinping and his policies, that of course would say that this might not be successful, this new social contract. But my sense, and I think Liz was talking about this also, is that they actually blame Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin and the past policies of the economic reform era. And that if you had done the survey, even in like 2018 before COVID, or 2016, even when Xi Jinping had only been in office for a few years, I think that you might have seen some of these similar trends, in that what we were starting to see is this idea that the reform era was good for certain things, but it was no longer working for regular people and needed to be changed. In which case, then, Xi's policies for common prosperity might be well received by regular citizens, and they might support these policies. And then the second thing that's also unclear is, will voluntary redistribution and state-led economic reform that are in the common prosperity policies, will this result in equitable and comprehensive growth? And that's really hard to say, because historically state-led economic growth has had clear limits. And, Scott knows this better than I do, but, historically this kind of economic model is inefficient, and it's better for developing hardware than it is for software. And so I don't know if this will actually be successful, but these are two things that I think are going to be really important in whether common prosperity can become a new social contract. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jessica. Well, I think it's good. Thank you for raising this idea of a social contract being revised and also renegotiated. And maybe the answers to the survey are part of the response to that new social contract that's being offered. But let's ask Qin Gao about that, because you spend a lot of time looking at social policies in China and how they're implemented, and how people are attracted or unattracted to them, and what works and doesn't work. How do you see the results of this data speaking to how issues that you look at are being perceived, and where are things headed?
Thank you so much. So happy to join this panel to listen to the new findings and share some thoughts with each other and with our audience members. First, I want to applaud Marty and Scott and your colleagues for doing this amazing new wave of the survey. It's hard work, and I don't think we thought it was possible, but you made it happen. And sharing these findings with us reminds us all people's opinions matter. I think for a long time, we relied on GDP growth data, income and wealth data, but what people think and how people perceive the future matter a great deal. And I think it will matter even more in the future, as Liz was suggesting. So I thank you for doing this important work and sharing the findings with us. I want to share 2 points in relation to what Scott K. you were saying. The first is one thing that really stood out from your findings is that education as the core indicator of human capital doesn't seem to matter that much at all, not much anymore. It used to matter big time. So I recall about 30 years ago when I went to college, that's the only thing that mattered. So the message our generation got was, you study hard, you get into college, you will change your life. More so for the rural kids than for the urban kids. But that was true for a whole generation. But that's probably no longer the case, both in reality and in people's perceptions, as your survey powerfully revealed. So I think that means a lot for the country because people will not look for education as a way for turning their lives into a different direction or for upper mobility. As your results showed, connections, social capital mattered more than human capital. So I think that's very important, and probably more research can be done for that. Scott Roselle, you did so much research about the rural-urban education gap. I think for a lot of rural kids, realizing education will not make a big change for their lives. The investment in education will not improve their life opportunities that much. I think that's important for China's future, for people's future. The point about social contract is such an important point. I think a lot about this in my research, but also very much in connection with your findings. I think there are two ends of this equation. On the one hand is the economic growth. China, of course, saw the rising tide for so many years, which helped people in material well-being and also perceptions, optimism. But on the other end of this equation is social protection, healthcare, education, pensions, and Dibao, social safety net. So all of those increased for sure over the past 30, 40 years for Chinese citizens. But their pace of growth didn't stay in step with economic growth. The urban-rural gap of social protection, especially in pensions and healthcare, narrowed over time. But the gap remains and still will be there for a long time if we don't have serious fiscal reform. So my own research shows exactly that. Inequality is persisting in social protection as well. And that for people to have security for their safety, to know that they will have something to fall back on when they get old, when they feel sick, when they are sick. That's very important. So I think this finding is reflecting both on the social contract becoming different in terms of both economic growth and also social protection, not catching up. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Three fantastic interventions in reaction to this path-breaking research. Let me turn back to Marty and Scott Rozelle for your initial reactions, responses to the comments that we heard from Liz, Jessica, and Chin.
Okay, thank you all for your comments, and I don't have well-organized or clear thoughts. Just a couple of comments in terms of Jessica's mentioning of the Common Prosperity Campaign. I must say that so far I'm one of the critics of, I mean, Xi Jinping launched this campaign in 2021, and there were a few high-profile things that were done, like requiring charitable contributions by rich entrepreneurs and closing down after-school tutoring and other kind of things. But at least since then, it seems to me it's a kind of slogan. And I think a lot of people felt China had become too unequal, and there should be a lot of changes to try to make it more unequal. And some of them are quite obvious, like, for instance, the hukou system, which is, in some ways, China is extraordinary in having rural versus urban being, in some ways, the primary axis of inequality. That's not the case. I mean, rural-urban is important in America, we know, and these days even politically, but it's not the same as in China. And they've been talking for, more than 2 decades about, reforming and phasing out the hukou system, but it's only around the edges still, so at least I'm having a hard time finding a new social contract that people can believe in coming out of the Common Prosperity Campaign when I don't see much of anything very concrete coming out of the Common Prosperity theme, except, platitudinous propaganda in favor of social equality. That's very good. And I would say in terms of Chin's comments, that, and this relates a little to what Jessica said, I would point out that the efforts to improve the social safety net and spread the benefits started before Xi Jinping. I mean, he's continued them onward, but really, people want to blame Hu Jintao, et cetera. But in fact, a lot of things were being done in the Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao era to begin, most of the major initiatives to spread the social welfare benefits, particularly to people in the countryside, but also to non-Danwei people in the cities and so forth. really began, and the rebuilding of the rural medical insurance system and so forth, they all began long before Xi Jinping came into power. So I think one other thing I'll point, I have a different paper on Xi Jinping and inequality, objective inequality, not the attitudes. In 2013, the State Council released a 35-point concrete program for combating inequality that included all kinds of things like introducing property taxes and so forth. And essentially it disappeared from view. So Xi Jinping went, he did some things, but basically the conclusion of my paper is that Xi Jinping did not do much of anything very substantively important to try to combat rising inequality. And as a result, China still is an extraordinary unequal society that they haven't figured out how to effectively counteract that, even though there are some obvious things that could be done, but don't seem to be politically feasible at the moment.
Scott Rizzo?
Yes, Marty. Yeah, Marty picked up a lot of points. I was thinking, I thought Liz's comment of that the performance legitimacy, is certainly part of what's happening out there, but it's deeper than that. And I think that that's like the most fundamental comment that was there. Very, very important. And I actually thought Jessica's comment that not only social media anti-corruption campaign, I think we need to add a paragraph. I thought that's very, very, very interesting. And because I know at least on the rich side, I don't think the poor people think much about that, but people on the rich side think a lot about that and how it's come down. And our paper is full of head effects. So we just didn't have time to go into it today, but these are really good comments, Jessica. I want to go back to exactly just reiterate what Marty said, but also from an economist point of view, if your social contract doesn't have incomes rising and risk falling, this new social contract isn't going to work. So whether we have a new social contract or it's the old, a failure of the old economic performance contract, that's what's happening. When unemployment is up, when property prices are down, when consumption is down and investment is down and exports are down, social protection hasn't gone up. If you know, Jessica, and I'm sure that, and Liz, who's just been to the countryside, been to China and talked to people, people aren't getting paid, right? And people are sharing jobs on the service sector side. And so, I think that this new social contract has to take that into consideration. And if the rich and the poor are both being hurt by this new social contract, that's really where I think that they have to step back and say, we need this new social contract that actually, makes life better for everyone. And so I think there's the great big, and as Jessica did say, there are no state planned economies in the upper income world, and if China wants to go there, that's going to be the real test. I'm going to stop right there. Fabulous comments. I took notes on everybody, so thank you guys.
Good. Yes. Let me throw a few things onto the table and then go back to everybody and for comments. We only have a few minutes left, and we obviously could sit here all day and pore over this data because it's so rich. And I think actually scholars and policymakers will eventually be digging deeply into all the different kinds of data. Let me ask three kinds of questions and then ask folks to follow up. And it's okay if you leave questions on the table that aren't answered as well. So one of the most interesting elements of that I saw in the data was about education. Because actually the attitudes and changes towards education were first seen in the 2014 survey, not the 2023 data. That's the one where the data began to change earlier, particularly amongst people who were trying to explain why they weren't successful. and it wasn't about education then. And so I'm curious about the education variable. And I notice that my friends in China, who I still emphasize the education for their kids. Their kids still study from morning until night. A lot of them still send kids, if they can, sometimes send their kids abroad. That people still think education is a very important route to success, and because they invest so much of their money. So I'm really curious about that one variable. I'm also curious about a variety of different kinds of policies that Xi Jinping might be able, or the leadership might be able to adopt regarding taxes, local government, ways to redistribute wealth that also may create sources of growth, particularly for consumption. If consumption is supposed to be the future of growth, not investment, then redistributive policies might actually be helpful in generating that kind of growth. And last is about the politics of this. I encountered in my trips a lot of the skepticism and malaise that Liz has encountered on her trips and in talking to people. And what I've seen is instead of people, outright on the streets, although, we saw at the end in November of 2022 in response to zero COVID, is people, quote unquote, laying down, tangping, sort of not working hard or avoiding taking on responsibilities, or what I would call laying low, continuing to try to do things, but avoiding attention. And also we've seen some leaving. We've seen some people trying to move their money, their people. As you know, the U.S. southern border had seen the most number of Chinese in the last few years, particularly in 2023 and 2024. So I think that we would summarize this in political science language as exiting from participating in the political system, which has other kinds of consequences, maybe for the type of capacity implementation. So I'm curious about other ways in which the Chinese political system could be affected, even if it doesn't result in outright demonstrations or anger on the streets. So those are sort of three queries that I had. Why don't we start with Liz, then Jessica and Chin, and then end back on Marty and Scott for a final windup.
Thank you, Scott. I guess, yes, certainly if we look at popular reactions, voice is not an easy action possibility for many people, to the extent that loyalty is less attractive. We're seeing, to some extent, exit, but we're also seeing something that was referred to in the paper by Marty and Scott and their colleagues, and that is what the Chinese themselves referring to as involution, neijian, right? The fact that people are not just tangping, they're not just lying flat. Maybe some young people are, certainly, but an awful lot of people are working like crazy to invest, particularly in education for their kids. And, person after person told me how anxious they feel because of the competitiveness of this involution, that the state is not really there for them. The opportunities are dwindling. The demographic crisis is creating enormous pressure. And so rather than going out and spend on the consumer society that the regime might like to see flourishing, they're investing everything in their kids and in their education. So I think that it's not simply exit, but a sense of trying to figure out how to game the system, but in ways that are involuted and that are not really economically productive for the overall system.
Thanks. Jessica?
I just wanted to say one thing about the common prosperity policies. What we're seeing is a similar process that Xi undertook with the Belts and Roads Initiative. So he didn't come up with the Belts and Road Initiative. Most of the investments sort of predated, 2012, 2013. And even a lot of the big policies that he's announced were already underway or under negotiation. What he seems to be doing with Common Prosperity is a similar process of taking the policies that WHO tried to roll out but was ineffective, and he's actually making those policies effective and calling them Common Prosperity. So that's sort of a pulling in of old policies, a rebranding, but also changing the way that they're being enacted in such a way that they're more effective. We see this in sort of the Go West policies and the urbanization policies, that these have become much more rapid and effective. We also see this in the poverty alleviation campaign. This was part of Common Prosperity. It was one of its big keynote policies. But also really interestingly, in what I study, looking at civil society, the new charity law will go into effect in September. It has been completely rewritten to include tax benefits for donations, including for wealthy families and wealthy companies to come up with what's called a charitable trust. It's a brand new concept in China. It had that a lot of the legislation in this new charity law had to figure out who is the trustee, what powers and responsibilities do they have, what is a charitable trust? Is it just money laundering, or is it something more significant? These are some really big policies from my way of thinking. The ability to move money around through tertiary distribution in a way that the tax system is being rewritten to support. So I know it might not be super flashy yet, but I do think there is something there to Common Prosperity. And I just wanted to point that out. And for what Scott said, both Scotts actually, Scott Rozelle said, if there isn't growth in this social contract, is it really useful? And then Scott Kennedy talked about, this new generation maybe exiting the system or lying flat. And I guess what would be interesting is if you could pull apart your survey data by income, especially if you have parents' income, it'd be interesting to see if those trends are different. Because what I'm seeing in a lot of the research I'm looking at with the Gen Z cohort, as far as volunteering and donation, but also we've been asking these questions about what is a meaningful life? What do you think a life of meaning is? And what we're finding is that all of them are saying no 996, right? We're not going to work all the time just to earn some money. That money by itself is not meaningful. And that what the COVID experience, where they were sacrificing their college careers and their social lives for elderly people in their community, part of what that showed them was that there's something more to life. There can be something more than just earning a wage. And so I'm seeing this really big shift in people saying that what matters is that everybody is taken care of, and that they're willing to sacrifice income for things like environmental protection, or in our surveys, we find a lot of support for left behind children and reallocating resources to that demographic. So I think that the social contract might be changing, not just from Xi's conceptualization, but also in response to this new generation and what they think is a meaningful life.
Thank you. Chin?
Sure, thank you. Briefly, I want to say this is a critical moment. Both these findings are very sobering, but also COVID, many other things that's been happening are very sobering. So it's a soul-searching moment for the Chinese leadership. I think we have a full menu of what could be done to improve the well-being, narrow inequality, make people to have faith and believe in the future again, but it takes political will, whether there is political will to address these issues or whether the political will is elsewhere. I think that's the critical question. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
All right. Marty and Scott, give you guys a final word before I wrap things up.
Just a couple of things. This paper was intended mainly as an overview of the general patterns. So it's possible we could get our colleagues to do some more analyses. There are a couple of appendix tables in the paper that do separate people by income, but we really don't comment on those. But back to how the system is operating and how it seems to be stalled and not able to do things that are obviously need being done to promote greater equality. I think back to another paper that was given at the AAS meetings a year ago by Andy Walder, another Stanford colleague, which was then published in the China Journal. And basically, he points out that one of the major obstacles in China is their lousy fiscal system and the taxes. The Chinese, state finances, the taxation system, do not redistribute almost at all. There's more redistribution from the rich to the poor in America and in Russia than there is in China. They really need to fundamentally, if they're going to have funds to do things like improve rural education, to pay for the costs of educating migrant kids in the biggest cities and all these other kind of things, they've got to have a fiscal system that's designed to do it. And at the moment, the fiscal system just makes these things almost impossible.
Scott Rizzo?
Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to the upcoming third plenum, and going to be taking notes. Are we going to see a slew of policies like Jessica was talking about rolled out, or are we going to see new key productive forces, which that's all anybody talks about in the government, and that's all anybody talks about in the local government, and that's all anybody talks about in the companies. And that means having massive investment into high-tech automation, robots. And guess what is, we're going to have 300 million rural people without jobs. To me, one of the most basic common prosperity policies that can be going. I've been trying to lecture on this and talk to people about this in my last 3 months here, is we need rural unemployment insurance. Right now, no rural people are ever unemployed because they always have a farm to go back to. But people under 40 who have a rural hukou work on the farm, and when they lose their job, and they're losing their job in the property sector, in the manufacturing sector, what do? Right? I mean, they don't have any source of support as they go try to find another job, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it's going to be interesting to see where we go from here. I think it's Gene, you said it best. This is at a critical moment, and I'm looking forward to doing this again in a while. Scott K, you and Ilaria, thank you. I thought it was very, very interesting. We're gonna have to rewrite our paper, Marty.
Oh no!
With all these
Not yet.
comments.
No.
Oh no!
You just need to write another paper. That's what.
Good idea.
So,
thank you.
This
everybody.
is the research that you all and your colleagues presented and shared with us, and we really appreciate the opportunity for Big Data China to be a platform for this data to be initially presented as a first cut to the global community, shows that the stakes are very high. This isn't just about trying to get growth faster again. It is about trying to figure out how China in a different period can continue to gain popular support and address the kind of challenges that people believe need to be addressed so that they can have productive, successful lives, however they define the meaning of those lives. That is very, very difficult for any country to make that kind of transition, and certainly one the scale of China that it's gone through, and also the way its politics are structured, and the political economy of who has more or less power makes it extremely difficult, despite all of the levers of power and sources that the leadership and the government have. This is no easy task. It isn't absolutely impossible, but gosh, I wouldn't want this in my inbox for having to solve. It is, and so we'll be watching the third plenum, but not just the third plenum, how these things are implemented and how people respond, because it's not just what is in speeches and in documents, but it's what happens in the daily lives of average Chinese and how they react to all of this.